here with prison
Do we still want to read each other's
critical resistance. Please give them your attention. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you. Good morning. We have a PowerPoint that I think due to technical limitations we're going to have on loop. Linda.
Oh, fine.
Okay. So we wanted to give you a little bit more context into who we are before we get going. We're going to keep an eye on time and make sure we leave time for questions from all of you. I'm going to introduce Linda first, and then we can hear a tiny bit about me, and then we'll get into it. So Linda Evans has been an advocate for social justice her whole life, starting with organizing to end the Vietnam War in the 1960s. She was active in the women's liberation movement and a leader of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, which fought against white supremacy and the Ku Klux Klan. In 1985, she was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison for actions protesting U.S. government policies. She completed both a BA and MA degrees in prison. In 2001, she won a presidential pardon and was released after serving 16 years in prison. With others, she co-founded All of Us or None, a grassroots civil rights organization of formerly incarcerated people and their families. She's currently an active member of California Coalition for Women's Prisoners, a member of the Critical Resistance Advisory Board, and works with immigration defense efforts in Santa Rosa. So let's give a quick little more.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure most of you noticed that I was probably born before, I've been around a lot longer than any of you, so I'm really grateful to be part of this conversation today. Rehana Lerandeau is an Oakland native, an abolitionist organizer, and a member of Critical Resistance. Critical Resistance seeks to build an international movement to end the prison industrial complex by challenging the belief that caging and controlling people makes us safe. CR believes that basic necessities such as food, shelter, and freedom are really what make our communities secure. As such, Critical Resistance's work is part of global struggles against inequality and powerlessness. The success of our movement requires that we reflect communities most affected by the prison industrial complex. Because CR's work seeks to abolish the prison industrial complex, it cannot support any work that extends the life or scope of prisons.
Thank you.
It wasn't much about her, though.
Well, one day my bio is going to be as exciting as Linda's, but I'm not quite there yet. So, all right. So first, before we get into a conversation, and we're going to sort of interview each other and just have a dialogue around our work. Really excited to be here. I did want to do a really quick overview of Critical Resistance. So Critical Resistance is a national grassroots organization. It was founded in 1998, and Linda's going to tell us a little bit about that a bit later. We have chapters. Our headquarters is in Oakland. We have chapters in Los Angeles, Portland, and New York. It's a volunteer, member-led organization. Our work seeks to abolish the prison industrial complex. So that means that we can't support any work that would extend the life and scope of what we call the PIC. So I'll probably be saying PIC from now on, prison industrial complex. I think the biggest thing to remember when it comes to CR's abolitionist politic is that we don't believe that the system is broken. We believe that the system is working exactly as it was intended. Therefore, it can't be reformed or fixed. It needs to be abolished. So with that being said, I know that when it comes to abolition, even amongst other organizing communities, there's a lot of myths around abolition, and I wanted to dispel some of those before we got into this conversation so it's not churning in the back of your head the whole time. So the first one that I wanted to talk through is that abolitionists believe in a world without jails and prisons. We believe in a world without police and surveillance. We don't believe that all of that can happen tomorrow simultaneously, right? Like, we're not riding out, tearing everything down at the same time. That's not a good strategy. It's not practical. We are talking about lessening the life and scope of these institutions and slowly abolishing the PIC by chipping away at it slowly and strategically. So what that means is that sometimes we do engage in what we call abolitionist reforms. Means that we will kind of work within the state. We will work within certain reforms as long as those reforms are framed as actually lessening the scope of the PIC, right? So if it's a reform that's going to fix or alter and continue to grow the PIC, we're not interested. And we can go into that later. The other thing is that abolition is not just theoretical. We're not, sitting around talking about abolition and not taking action. It's not like a purely academic or scholarly way of going about things. It's truly a very practical strategy. And we also win a lot. I think people don't realize how many big wins abolitionist organizing has accomplished. So things like stopping gang injunctions in North Oakland effectively, stopping the biggest police militarization war games, which was called Urban Shield. We stopped that. We recently stopped a jail plan to expand jails in Los Angeles. We're currently fighting to shut down a jail in San Francisco. So it's very practical, it's very strategic, and it does work. And I think another one that I want to cover is that abolitionists don't believe in punitive solutions to harm. So we're not looking to replicate systems like policing. And I wrote down in my notes to say that my mom, I think when I think about if I'm articulating abolition clearly, it's like, does it pass the mom test? Like, can I tell my mom about it? And she's like, oh yeah, I get that. When she was first learning about abolition, she said, oh yeah, so you all don't believe in police, you want to police each other. It's like, no, there's just no policing, not just shifting the mechanism of policing to a different body. And then the last thing before we move on is critical resistance's tagline, if you will, is dismantle, change, build. And I want to put an emphasis on the build. So we are looking to dismantle systems of oppression. We're looking to radically transform our societies, but we're also building solutions at the same time. So we're also not just tearing down and not focusing on building up the solutions. Okay, did I miss anything?
No, I think it's good.
Okay, great. So really quickly, we also wanted to frame this discussion around what you've already learned. I think we're last, right? This is the last one?
Well, we had some rescheduling due to fire.
Yeah, okay.
So you're the second to last.
We're the second to last. We'll take it. Okay. So I think I read through your series curriculum online a bit. You're all super lucky. I did not have this in my university experience. It's great. And a couple different things that stood out to me was that you had conversations around identity with the L Law Trans Latinas, and we kind of wanted to bring up that, like, having the freedom to hold your own identity without fear of repression or retaliation is really central to our movements. Though Linda and I were talking earlier, and we want to make sure that it's clear that having a deep identity politics where we can't collaborate against the broader systems isn't something that we want to ride for, but that this idea of identity is very central. You also heard from CR movement partners like Gabriella and A-Rock on global narratives, and you also heard from some folks around the local displacement of people from land, and talking about the Bay Area folks. I love that it mentioned in the bio that the displacement of bodies and narratives through eviction. So you kind of saw identity, you saw global issues, and you saw local issues, and all of those things could be framed as abolitionist. Like, there could be an abolitionist strategy to practically everything you've learned. And we also wanted to talk through the Abolish ICE. Has anyone heard about Abolish ICE? Quick raise of hands. Did you want to say a couple of words on that?
Well, I know that it's often the case that when you're on campus at a university, you get a little divorced from the community that surrounds you. Now, the fire, I live in Santa Rosa. I experienced the power outages and the fire and the evacuation, just like all of you. And I feel like it's really important for you to take an active role as much as you can in the community, too. So, for example, in terms of abolishing ICE, one of the things that we're trying to do here in Sonoma County is to get the county to divest all of its investments in core civic and geo which are the corporations that run the immigration detention centers at the border and elsewhere. I think just in light of the kind of conversation that we're going to have, I want to also point out that they are also the largest private prison corporations, and many, many contracts with the federal prison system, the Bureau of Prisons, and state prisons go to GEO and CoreCivic. So by this county divesting from investments in those companies, we will, hurt them. That's the point. So we've been building a divestiture campaign here in the county. December 17th, put it on your calendar. You can go to the Board of Supervisors and have a voice. You can also, of course, email them. We would appreciate any comments that you might want to make. But I think it's critical that here in Sonoma County, where we do have a voice, where we do have communities organized to have a voice with the Board of Supervisors, that we do voice our opinions about where the county's money should be invested and why it is absolutely immoral for any kind of investment to be going to GEO, CoreCivic, or the banks that support them. So that's an example of where a divestment, which actually is an abolitionist strategy, where divestment is something that you can do locally and support.
Thanks. So we hope that we can bring that tactically to something like Sonoma County. A couple of you have heard of Abolish ICE, and I don't think that divestment is necessarily touted as an abolitionist strategy, but it is. That's something that would reduce the life and scope of the PIC. So we want to kind of make that tangible for you. And hopefully you can start to think through everything that you've learned in this series and apply an abolitionist lens and strategy to it. It's actually quite tactical and practical. It's one of the many reasons why I love abolition. So I think to get our collaborative conversation going. While abolition is a practical strategy, it's also a vision. It's a vision of the world that we want to live in, and imagination is really important to abolitionist organizing. And I think that the North Star that keeps us going is imagining a world without police, without prisons, without surveillance. I'd love to hear what you think that world might look like.
And we would love also for some of you to participate in this pop-up discussion, because imagination is not something that necessarily is encouraged enough, I think. So my imagining a world without prison really goes to where the first time that I was locked up. I did 16 years in federal prison, but I was locked up a whole bunch of other times for my political activities. And the first time, I remember very, very distinctly what it was like to be in a cage. And that is not a place where anyone should be. No people should be in cages. I don't really think animals should be in cages either. But the fact that actually the state, the U.S. state, believed that they could stop me from being a political activist by locking me up, trying to silence me in that way, it was a very educational experience. But being locked up physically and being absolutely unable to control anything about your life is a frightening experience. And I think that, beyond the experience of trauma that it really does incur in people, in individuals, we need to also think about our whole communities and the way they are traumatized by all of the individuals that have been in prison, have lost their jobs, have lost their homes because of being arrested, because of, even maybe a short stay in the county jail. Then think about those pictures that you all saw during the outrage about what was happening on the borders. And if any of you have been arrested and held in a holding cell, imagine 40 days of alternating standing and sitting on the floor, which is what those people had to do. So I think that when we imagine the kind of world that we want to live in, we need to think about what are the conditions, what are the ways that we can solve the problem of people breaking the laws that make our society work. We can solve these problems, and a lot of progress has been made in that regard already, but We have to start with no cages.
Yeah, I like that a lot, and I think that the idea of dismantling, just envisioning no cages, and something that you said of the experience of not being able to control any part of your life as being deeply, deeply transformative, and something that was awful to experience. And I wonder for y'all, if you're thinking about an abolitionist vision for a future, I wonder what types of things make you feel really free. Like, what types of things make you feel safe, make you feel like your community's thriving, make you feel like you can show up as your full self? What are some things? And it doesn't have to be totally next level. Like, it can be very simple. Like, I think for me, something really small that I appreciate about my workplace, that I would want to see in an abolitionist world is, like, I get to dress however I want. Like, I'm not playing some kind of corporate game where I have to show up in a monkey suit and, do this, that, and the other. And that makes me feel like I'm free to express my identity. What other things do you think would be a part of that? Yeah.
Having my pronouns respected and used.
For sure. Yeah, definitely. Perfect example. Other folks? Yeah.
So I'm an Aztec dancer, so I think it's really dope when we get to hold ceremony in our traditional spaces.
Very cool. We had some beautiful dance ceremonies at the beginning of our 20th anniversary event with CR, and it was really great to bring that legacy to this space. What else? We heard pronouns, personal identity being respected, respecting heritage, and bringing that kind of cultural entity into the space. A couple more things. Yeah.
Less bureaucratic gatekeeping to, like all the hoops that you have to jump to just get through school, to get into school, to get a degree, which people that don't have the resources are just kind of stranded and there's really not enough outreach.
Yeah.
So, some more community involvement and outreach.
So unblocked access and equal access to resources, the things that we need to be well and healthy. Yeah.
Something along the lines of universal basic income. Like making sure that basic human needs are met, so we can explore those things
Yeah.
beyond. When we feel safe, we can explore those things beyond that.
I like that you framed that as safety, of just access to basic needs as safety. Yeah. Those are great. You're all abolitionists already. It's easy stuff.
I'm also going to add in there, no guns. No guns for cops, no guns in the community, no guns. Then maybe we could have a chance at really instituting restorative justice as a way of solving arguments instead of killing each other.
I like that. Thank you for mentioning that. So next I'm going to ask you a couple questions around abolition as a more, so we just took it super personal and close. Let's widen it out to abolition as an internationalist struggle. But first, would you mind just kind of telling us about the beginnings of CR?
Yeah. While I was in prison, the critical resistance movement was really beginning. And at one point, close to the initial conference, my partner, Eve Goldberg, and I were working on a document, on an analysis called The Prison Industrial Complex and the Global Economy. It's still available on the internet. And basically what we were trying to get to was an analysis of how the prison system inside the United States is related to the industries that create and maintain the prison system internationally. And, just recognizing how much of the U.S. prison and policing equipment and methodology comes from Israel, for example, where they are seriously killing Palestinian people inside their prison system. I think that was kind of the main thing that we wanted to emphasize, was that the prison system here in the United States has not developed independent of the policing that is going on around the world, which includes things like what's happening in Hong Kong right now, where hundreds of people are in prison because of their protesting for democracy. So I think that it's important as we look at the prison system here, including locally, where there are things to be done in the Sonoma County Jail, as well as, understanding that it's an international system of repression, and it serves those global corporations.
Yeah, and I think from the CR perspective in more recent years, one example of that was our campaign to stop Urban Shield. And Urban Shield was a police militarization and weapons expo and a training that happened in Alameda County. We effectively shut it down. We got them to move it not only out of Oakland, they tried to move it to Dublin. We said, no, this has not just out of Oakland, like just not at all, which is also an abolitionist strategy, is not using a not in my backyard tactic. So we want it gone, not moved. But that expo was not only training the cops in Oakland and Alameda County, but it was also training the Israeli police forces. So we saw that direct link between local and international struggle. And so that win was really big on a local level and as well on a global level in terms of fighting policing.
I just wanted to mention that this reminds me of when I was a student at Michigan State University, and we actually had the largest police administration school in the world on our campus.
Wow.
And there were two things. Number one, the police administration school there was training the secret police in Saigon. So for the South Vietnamese government. They were training the political police there. And, also the fact was that the campus was an occupied area, in particular because we had that big police administration school. And there was a raid on the campus for pot years ago, obviously, and 7 police forces were mobilized, and a lot of people were busted. So interesting how the police administration schools here in the United States actually have done a lot of training of people all over the world.
That's really interesting. And what I think it strikes me when you were talking about divestment as a strategy, like how much funds were put into mobilizing 7 police forces for a raid on marijuana on a campus. I think for my abolitionist vision, we get to smoke weed wherever we want as well. I'm going to add that to the mix. So those are some really good examples from your university days and the CR side, but I'd love to hear how you see the work that you're doing with the California Coalition for Women's Prisoners as both local and internationalist.
Well, I'm mindful of our time, and I'm hoping that everybody got the handouts that I passed out so that you can reflect on the campaign to end life without parole here in California. Now, clearly, it's a reform. We're not, I think one of the main things that motivated me to become a member of Critical Resistance and a part of the advisory board was when I first got out of prison, the vision was we're going to close down prisons. And it still is. Now, dropping LWOP, life without parole sentencing, is not going to close any prisons. It's going to hopefully end in the release of the people who are currently serving life without parole, which is 5,200 people. Most of them, as you can see from the fact sheet, most of them were accessories to the crime. They were not the shooter, so to speak. Our position is not that the shooters deserve to be in prison and everybody else deserves to be free, however. We believe that everybody who has been sentenced to LWOP should be allowed the opportunity to face the parole board. That's not really giving people a whole hell of a lot, honestly. If any of you have any kind of relationship or have people in prison that have faced the parole board, they're not community-based. They are primarily law enforcement. It's extremely difficult to get approved by the California Parole Board, the Board of Prison Hearings, the Board of Parole Hearings, to approve your release. However, we think that life without parole sentencing is an abomination. And it has grown up in California through a series of ballot initiatives, which makes it even harder to get rid of it. There have been 6 separate ballot initiatives that added during that period of time where everybody was, tough on crime, we got to lock those people up, as if that was going to be a solution. They enhanced the life without parole sentencing to the point where now people who are driving a car, waiting outside of a drug deal, and something goes bad and somebody gets killed, those people that were not even on the scene are going to go to prison for life without parole. So we're trying a series of methods, that are abolitionist in their essence. And I think that's one of the things we wanted to communicate with you all, is that abolition is not just closing down prisons, it's an approach, it's a strategy to lessening surveillance, lessening repression in our communities. So to drop LWOP, we are going to start with a resolution in the California Senate to end life without parole sentencing as another death penalty, as death by incarceration, because that's what it is. And we hope to develop a public education campaign and build public support by doing things like this for public understanding that death by incarceration is a death penalty. And people should, number one, we're opposed to the death penalty, but life without parole is not an alternative. So as we build out our campaign, I really hope that some of you will participate. You can go to www.droplwop.com and get more information.
And I think it's really a decarceration strategy, right? Because we can't close down the jails and prisons without getting all those folks out first. And I imagine that strategy can transition internationally as well in terms of people with no opportunity to get released. So I think that we have a lot of learning from the work that you're doing there.
Well, it's also part of a real international and national campaign against extreme sentencing.
Yes. Yeah.
That's in many states and in many countries. This country has the worst sentencing policies in the whole world, though, and the highest rate of incarceration. So that's where we're starting at.
Yeah. And I think that really speaks to the abolitionist tradition and vision. We really don't go for the low-hanging fruit. Like, we're out here moving the heavy rocks. Yeah. Okay, so I think that given that this is a feminist lecture series, I wanted to ask you one question about abolition as a women or female identified struggle. And I know that the folks from Gabriella have helped y'all tie, women's issues to broader democratic issues for all people. So we'll talk about it as a women's issue, but understanding that there are connections to all of our liberation when we're talking about women's issues. So a lot of the time in CR's work towards abolition versus reform, we've seen pushback on legislators or other bodies saying that, like, well, we're going to make jails better, and especially for women or trans folks, like, we're going to make gender responsive jails, and this is going to be, a big step in the direction of criminal justice reform. What do you think about that as a strategy in terms of, I think we're both on the same page. Do you think that that's a good move? Because a lot of people think that that's super important. So how do you balance conditions today versus abolitionist vision tomorrow when it comes to these gender responsive jails? Or what would your response be to that?
They're no good.
Yeah. No.
They're no different than any other jail. We, California Coalition for Women Prisoners, works really under the leadership of the women inside. That's where the campaign to drop LWOP came from. Also the campaign Me Too Behind Bars, which addresses violence by guards against trans and gender nonconforming people inside men and women's prisons. So that actually is a lawsuit at the moment, and we're developing grassroots support. That's what the campaign is going to be about. But gender responsive prisons are prisons. They're jails. They're, our position is that people don't belong in those jails. And most of the crimes that women actually commit are economically based or based in addiction. Mm-hmm. So,
right. And jails and prisons are fundamentally violent institutions. So whether or not they're gender responsive, you're still incarcerated. You're still in a cage.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's weak. All right. So yes. Go ahead.
My friend has been leading us so well. I had one question for her.
Yes.
In the current campaign to shut down County Jail 4 in San Francisco, which is known as 850 Bryant, you guys have seen some of the pictures here. One of the major campaign tactics and demands is to shift the general fund budget away from criminalization and toward community resources. Now, how do you see this cooperating with the government as an abolitionist strategy? And is it surprising to you that an organization devoted to abolition like CR would work collaboratively with the state?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think when I was first coming into CR, I was surprised that we worked within the state where necessary. But I think that for us to, I love CR's take on abolition because it's practical. And again, we want to take the big rocks and we want to move within the system to shift power. And sometimes that means working with the state. You know, the legislation to close 850 Bryant is going to be introduced. So we had to get that rep bought into our cause to get that legislation tangible and practical to actually go to a vote to shut down the jail. The jail's been deemed seismically unsafe since 1996, and they still have not decarcerated that jail and shut it down. So where our goal is to actually close the jail through a decarceration strategy, so literally letting people out, part of that is moving those resources towards the types of community services that we know will actually make us safe, to what you were talking about earlier. So to shift the budget, we really need to work within the state, and that is an abolitionist tactic, to say, hey, all of this money, a fourth of the general fund in San Francisco County is going to these prisons, and we want to shift that away, decarcerate, shut down the jail, don't move people to Santa Rita, don't move people to other county jails, get them out and shut them down. And with that money that we have, that we need, I think for me it's been really shocking to see this this campaign to shut 850 Bryant and having divestment of that budget, or like redistribution of that budget, as part of that campaign strategy, happening in a very similar time frame that we saw things like the teacher strike in Oakland for more resources and funding for our schools. It's just such a clear comparison, right? Of like, we have, the money is there, the resources are there, all the things that we need to create the vision that we collaboratively thought through together as abolitionists is possible, but all of these resources are going to the police and they're going to prisons. And so that's the problem. We can't build what we want to see without getting that shift in power, and sometimes you have to shift those systems from within them.
And I think that's related, you know, to what we were talking about, or I was talking about earlier with Sonoma County. We also have a situation, you probably have read about it in the paper, with homeless people up in Santa Rosa in particular. There's just a real crisis because of the housing shortage and the expense. I know you guys know about that. And they are now going to devote county funds to hiring a private security company to police the Joe Rodota Trail and get people out of there where they're not providing places for them to go. So, you know, this is a very urgent issue for all of us, and I think that recognizing how abolition needs to frame our thinking, if we really want to move toward that vision, you know, that's what we're trying to do. So I think we should open it to questions. We have a few more minutes. Anybody want to say something, or?
I had a question about, like, what is your vision for people who, like, commit violent crimes? Like, my uncle was locked up for attempted murder. And, like, he said he met people in prison that he did not want on the streets because they just were, like, they were dangerous. So it was just kind of like, what is your vision for people like that? Because there is, like, I grew up in South Sacramento, like, I used to see, like, murders all the time, so it's just kind of like, I don't know, like, what is the vision to, like, helping people, like, stop that, like, because it is just kind of like, what do we do with that?
You do it.
Great. So I think for me as an abolitionist, when I see crime, especially violent crime, I don't see that as something inherent. It's a system of something, it's a symptom of something else. So if we transformed the conditions that we were in, where every single person had access to health, access to public education, healthy food, water, whatever, if we all had our basic needs met, and if we all had the tools, like I personally really am a fan of transformative justice work. Abolitionists aren't saying that harm isn't going to occur, it's how do we respond to that harm. So if we actually shifted the conditions that we were all in, would the folks who your uncle would have met in prison have ended up in that situation where the violence was happening? Because I think when we change the systems that we're in, when we change our environment and we learn how to relate to each other and handle conflict in a way that's generative, when we're not in a scarcity mentality or really an actual scarcity environment that's been created by these systems of oppression and by this unequal access to what we need, that's when we see violence cropping up. So I think that rather than saying this harm was happened, we're going to have a punitive approach to it, we have to really shift the entire condition that allowed that harm to happen in the first place. So that's a long game attempt. In the meantime, I think that there's different tactics that you can go about in terms of addressing immediate harm, but we have to think about what do we do today and what do we need to do more broadly, but the answer is never incarceration.
I was curious to know what you thought about basically, how do you deconstruct a system that is consistently growing, and then like how do we as students participate in that as well?
Well, I think that we've really, I mean, since I got out of prison, which was, in 2001, I have witnessed a real change in the consciousness, like public consciousness about incarceration. And I think it's really due to the movement, the abolitionist movement, the growth of a movement of people who have been in prison, and us really trying to influence public policy and bring a human voice about what it's like to be inside and its impact on our families. So I think there really has been a lot of progress in terms of building a determination that now is starting to be manifested in public policy, a determination not against mass incarceration, in part because I'm not telling you, it's extremely racist. I think it's an effort that really has been led by Black people and people of color, and the reduction of the amount of money going into the prison system is a really key part of what we're trying to do, which I think is why it's important to wage that struggle within. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, did that answer your question?
And I think to your point of like, how do we fight a system that's continuing to grow? That's exactly the type of things that you'd want to put an abolitionist lens on, of like, stop it from growing. Like, don't invest and participate in things that are going to expand the life and scope of the PIC. And that can look like a lot of different things. And I think that there are plenty of ways that students can get involved with campus-led organizing. And you'll want to look into the core issues that you're working towards and see, is it a reform or an abolitionist reform, and start to be critical and analytical about where your work is going and if it's going to improve upon a system that we know we should be working to dismantle, or if it's actually going to lessen it.
Well, also it's about criminalization. Mm-hmm. If we keep making more and more things against the law, and punished by imprisonment, then we're just going to really grow the system. So yeah. I think some of it is identifying what needs to be decriminalized. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
In your strategies, do you have strategies for restorative justice? And where that comes from is in my philosophy of law class, David Boonin writes a book on punishment, and he argues against that there is no punishment necessary, which argues against the consequentialist and the utilitarianist, in the sense that it seems that you're looking at a bigger picture, but if you can narrow the scope and put in processes that keep people from even going to jail, do you have some of those strategies that you do today?
I think decriminalization is a big one, and I also think that If anyone's familiar with the work of Mariame Kaba, something that she says, she's a transformative justice leader, founder of Survived and Punished. There's a different, Mariame Kaba, Kaba. There's a difference between punishment and consequences. So consequences for harm are going to exist, but that's very different than punishment. So for example, if someone is a manager at an organization and they harass someone, a consequence might be you need to give up that position of power and you can't work here anymore. A punishment would be you can never work again. So thinking through what are the ways that we address harm and figure out, one, how do we navigate harm together through a lens of transformative or restorative justice, but not that we're not going to react to harm at all. It's just how is it going to be responded to, and is it punitive or is it generative?
I think building, the whole question of dismantle, change, build, which is part of critical resistance, is, a slogan of ours. The building part is what we're really about. And like in Sonoma County, many places around the country have adopted rules in their education system where restorative justice is being implemented in elementary school. And that's a really important development. But the content of it is also important. I participated in a little orientation with one of my literacy students. And the company that is doing restorative justice for Santa Rosa refers to formerly incarcerated people as ex-convicts. I mean, it's just terrible language. So it's really important to have a critical approach as we build in restorative and transformative justice programs. We want to make sure that, they really are going to heal our community from the discrimination many people have faced. And I just want to end, because I know we're almost out of time or over time. If people sign those postcards, we will, and give them to me, we will send them in. You don't have to pay 25 cents to send it yourself, but I'd really appreciate your signatures. We're trying to get Governor Newsom to pay attention to all of the clemency petitions, and he actually is granting clemency to a lot of people who have had petitions in before Jerry Brown. So we're trying to pressure him to do more of it, and your postcards will help.
I think there's one more we have yet.
About how it seems like you're needing to expand consciousness and reflection about related violence and tradition in society.
Yeah.
That we only focus on this very narrow definition of certain communities, certain border people are criminalized and demonized and stigmatized and all of this. In actual fact, it's in poverty, it's in the way we treat environment and animals, and in brutal ways that we ignore around the world, sweatshops, war, etc. It's just everywhere. And we just have blinders to that and just look at the news and it's being shown as being the bad one, then we miss that. So it seems like it must be difficult to kind of stay focused in and also kind of address this huge societal issue of violence of our mentality.
Yeah, I think, am I hearing you correctly in that you're talking about ideology a bit, and how do you maintain or I guess widen the scope of not just looking at the results of all these other things of poverty, of criminalization, and what it results in is violence, and then there's just this hyper focus on a super criminalized narrative of punitive measures as being a solution to end tough on crime type things. And is your question, how do we broaden that, or how do we?
In trying to educate, is it hard not to bring in all of these things that we comment on that is all part of this system of control, which you guys touched on as well? But I'm just thinking about it, trying to tackle it. It just seems, there's so much that we just take for granted.
Yeah. So how do we shift perspective and ideology?
Honestly, I think that's just part of public education and political education. we're also, I don't know, defined by what is covered in the media, that we don't necessarily do enough critical thinking and exploring of what the facts really are about the world that immediately surrounds us. And, you know, I will definitely say I am very obsessed with the impeachment proceedings and like angry at Trump and ready to just, God, we got to get rid of him. But there are a lot of other things that are happening that we actually can influence maybe more directly than that. And I think really it's important to break out of that, the limitations that are kind of imposed on us, and expand our boundaries about what we're thinking about and how we address things, because we have a lot of power if we come together. And critical resistance has really showed that. I think CCWP also has. We've built a real coalition statewide to drop LWOP. So that is an existing method of social change that anybody can participate in and grow within. Because as you have one contact with an idea, you're the one that has to pursue the information. We're trying to put it out there, and certainly we need everybody's input about how to be effective. I think that's a really key thing, because these are ideas people don't necessarily think about, but they are critical. And the impact of mass incarceration in our communities is really untold. I mean, think of the trauma of all our children. So we gotta work on it.
And one thing that's critical and impactful that you can do right now that Linda mentioned is bring us your filled out postcards right here before you take off. I think we're at time.